Yours. Let's try that again. Shabbat Shalom. When Rabbi Artson trained me to be a rabbi, I learned very quickly that half of my job is being the sound guy. And my very first synagogue, I was like, hey, everyone, how do you work the soundboard? And they all said, we were hoping you would know when you got here. So I make sure to. I don't believe in long introductions because I figure like we want to hear Rabbi Artson more than you want to hear me, and maybe I'll say more tomorrow. But I want to tell you that one of my passions has been theology, and I've been largely disappointed in theology, including Jewish theology in many ways. I don't mean thoughts about God in Judaism. I mean those names who usually make it to Jewish theology study lists. And I felt that the way that I've so often heard courses, whereas you'd have a course on Jewish theology and you'd have 12 different chapters. And you do a week on each, and at the end they'd say, so did you like one? Maybe you take a little bit from chapter 12, a little bit in chapter 6. And I always found them deeply unsatisfying unless they're meant to be an insight into the person about whom the chapter was. Rabbi Artson takes a different approach, and he always has, and why he's been inspirational to me is that he's really, to me, talking about the God that I pray to, the God that I'm constantly in relation with, the God that in my epiphanies and my best moments, I'm trying to live up to those moments of insight. And so he talks in a holistic way, which I deeply value. For many of you, you might have everyday Torah or bedside Torah in your bedroom for dipping into what the parsha of the week is. When I teach Madrichim here and at camps, I use his Gift of Soul book, which is an incredible book on mentoring and on what it means to be that person in someone else's life. And now the books that have come out on our connection to the earth and our connection to the God of the earth, the God of science, and the God of Judaism are just profound influences on me. It's my honor to introduce to you our Rosenberg Scholar in Residence, Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson.
Thank you. It is really a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me? It's an odd sort of thing because you ask that question and the only people who aren't going to answer are the people who don't know you said something. So theology is always personal. Your relationship to the people who matter most is always based on your own temperament, your own history. And that's certainly true when you think large about the universe and about the creator of the universe. So to talk to you about how I got into my heretical ideas about God, which in some synagogues continue to get some people angry, who suspect that in the course of my theology, I'm going to destroy everything they love about Judaism and Western civilization. And then by the end of the talk, some of the people like it for that reason. So here's what I want to say. It's always personal. So if this doesn't resonate for you, that's okay. We all make sense out of the world we are born into with our own intuitions, our own ideas, our own character and temperament, and that's the way it is. But I want to offer this to people for whom mainstream dominant theology is broken. And so I'll tell you a story from my own life that helped me generate this new understanding, and it may work for you too. So I went to rabbinical school. At the time, they didn't have a rabbinical school at the Ziegler School, so the only place a conservative rabbi could become a rabbi was by going to New York to study. And I studied there for 5 wonderful years, and I was ordained. And I will tell you as congregants know, there is no creature on the planet so arrogant as a newly ordained rabbi. Of course, Rabbi Kane was the exception to the rule.
Yeah, I'm still arrogant.
Because at that point, you have all the answers and no life experience. Well, and you might even have questions, although those tend to get beaten out by the formal education system. So I went to a lovely little congregation in Mission Viejo, which is halfway in between Los Angeles and San Diego. It's exactly in the middle. For those of you who know California at all, kind of parallel to Laguna Beach. And I was there for 10 years, which were 5 of the happiest years of my life. It took me a while to notice I wasn't having quite so much fun. But in the midst of all of that, my wife and I were blessed to have twin children, Jacob and Shira. And by the time Jacob was 2.5, it was clear that he was developing differently than typical children. And, pardon me, they were not identical. One was a boy and one was a girl. I'm not going to be the one to explain the difference. But one of the weird things when you enter the world of neurodiversity is that people apologize when they shouldn't, and they don't apologize when they should. So at around 2.5, one of my congregants, wonderful, wonderful woman, I'm going to tell you her name because she's a hero in our story, Kathy DeLima, came over and said, Rabbi Artson, I'm really sorry, and it's probably not my business, but I wonder if you've ever thought of giving Jacob a kind of medical examination just to see what's going on. He's probably fine, but it might be worth looking into it. That's one of the things you shouldn't apologize for doing. Like, it's because of Kathy that we actually started getting Jacob the help that he needed. And it turns out he was diagnosed with autism. And he has a kind of severe version of it. He struggles a lot with motor impulse and controlling his body, and minimally verbal because of that. That's always a challenge. And for me, it was a professional challenge. Because I'm supposedly working for the guy who's planned it all and who is in charge of it all. And at the very least, this is no way to treat an employee. So, sorry. So I decided for 2 years that God and I were going to take a break. I wasn't going to talk to God. I wasn't going to talk about God. And I had the perfect job for that. I talked about Jewish holidays. I talked about Jewish ethics. I talked about Israel. I talked about the calendar. I talked about the Parsha, and I never let the G word out of my mouth. 2 years and nobody noticed. Think about that, what you want. And then I decided I really needed to do something. What kind of universe do we live in which I spend every day trying to help people rebuild their lives, hold their families together, live lives of value and holiness and goodness, and then my son is suffering? So how could that be? And there are 2 ways to go about figuring that out. The normal way would be to go to therapy, but my mother is a Freudian analyst. So that doesn't really work for me so well. I adore my mother. She's great. So the only other alternative I could think of was to get a doctorate, but a very weird doctorate. It was a doctorate in what kind of universe are we living in? So I approached a saint of a man, Rabbi David Ellenson, who just passed away this past year, unfortunately, longtime teacher at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and then president of Hebrew College for many years. And just everyone who speaks about him says, as great as his scholarship, that's how great his personality was. He was just a saint of a guy. And I met with him and I said, all right, so here's what I want to tell you. I know what I want to do my dissertation on. And you can say, no, that's not a dissertation, and then I'll go away. But what you cannot do is suggest an alternative. Because if you suggest an alternative, it's going to be write a footnote on someone else's thought. And that's not what I need right now. I need to understand, how could this happen to me? So that's what I want to do. To really understand how this could happen to me, I need to start reading science. Because if you want to know about the actual physical world, you have to know biology and astronomy and chemistry and how universes get created and how neurology works and doesn't work. And so I'm going to need to do some deep reading about science. And then I'm going to need to figure out where God is in all of this. And I remember David said, well, Brad, that's not a very normal kind of dissertation, but okay. So we did. And so you're going to get the benefits and the burdens of that. Here's what I can tell you about what scientists know about the world. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. We perceive the world to be made out of solid objects that interact coercively by banging into each other. You, distinct entity, are sitting on a chair, distinct entity. But in fact, that's inaccurate. Those Newtonian descriptors are approximately true, approximately enough that you want to use Newtonian science to build a building or launch an airplane. But it's actually false, right? It's a very useful fiction, probably the most useful fiction ever, but it's a fiction, right? Because the universe is made of shimmering interactive patterns of energy that are constantly changing and also retaining some constancy across time. So the chair remains looking like a chair, and you, well, you just keep falling apart. What can you do? When in fact, the atoms that are you and the atoms that are the chair have been mingling this whole time. So we don't live in the universe we perceive. We don't live in a universe of solid things that bump into other solid things. We live in a universe of related energy. And everything that is constantly becoming. Meaning you're not the same as you were yesterday, and you'll be different tomorrow. And that is true for everything. And everything's becoming is shaped and constrained by a combination of inner development and responding to the world's changes around. That means nothing exists by itself. Everything exists in relationship. Everything is dynamic. Everything is becoming. Once you realize that, it changes certain things about the world and about you and about God. We have been taught to think that when you use the word God, whether you are a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, you mean something that is outside of space and time. That's what eternal means. It means time doesn't pertain to it. And that something is all-powerful and all-knowing and all good. You with me so far? My daughter, years ago in college, found out that Chabad would pay you to take an Introduction to Judaism class. So she took it with the worst possible motives. And the guy, this poor young new Chabad rabbi, started the class by saying, here's what God is: eternal, all good, all knowing, all powerful. And Shira has a volume control issue. she has no control over her volume. That's why she ended up being the coxswain on a women's crew team. She was perfect for it. So in the back of the room comes my daughter saying, that's not true, but loud enough so the whole room heard it. And adults, you know, when they speak to young adults, they think that the way to solve the problem is to speak slower and louder. So he slowly and loudly said to her, no, Shira, this is the definition of God. And Shira gave an answer that is brilliant because there's no response to it. She said to him, that's not true. I don't know the arguments, but my father does. I did that Chabad rabbi a favor, and I told Shira, don't go back to the class. He doesn't deserve you. Okay, so if we think about God as those omnis, we create an ethical puzzle that breaks our compass. Because here's what you do. If God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then you have to say that everything that happens is for the good. And if you want to say that, I want you don't have to say it out loud now, but think about someone in your life who's going through the worst tragedy in their entire life. You want to be the one to tell them that that's good? I can't. I can't say that everything that happens is for the best. There's a lot of things that have happened that have been really awful. Frankly, we Jews have been experiencing for the last several months pretty pure awful. So you want to say that everything that happens because God willed it, then you're blaming God. But then the moral part that's wrong is you then have to say, and it's good that it happened. I can't say that. I can't say that anymore because if I do, I'm betraying my son. I won't do that. His autism is a struggle for him. It has given his life challenges and difficulties that most young people don't have to face. And if that autism came from God, then I won't serve God. I want to say something very strong here. It would be immoral to serve such a God. I'll play that out in a Jewish tone. If God is all good, all knowing, and all powerful, then the 6 million murdered in the Shoah, you have to say God knew about it, could have stopped it, but didn't. And if God's all good, then that was for the good. Are any of you prepared to look at one of the 6 million, 1 million of which were babies and children, and say, a loving God made that happen? I can't. So here's what I want to say. And this is a teaching that I've also heard from no longer alive, Rabbi Harold Kushner. Since when did power become a Jewish value? Right? God can be very powerful, but not all powerful. God can be very smart, but not all knowing. But God's being good, you can't have Judaism without that claim. But to claim that God is good, you have to give up on God's power because you cannot hold both. Once you do that, then you come up with a very different understanding of what you mean by God. Remember how we're all becoming? We're all connected? For me, that's what God does in the world. God is the one out of whom we all emerge, the one who gives us all possibility. But here's what God never does. God never intrudes on your freedom or the freedom of any creature. The entire universe is facing an open future that we and God make together. Anyone who's a parent knows that. Do you remember before you were a parent and you fantasized about how perfect your children would be? and then you actually had them, and they come loaded with opinions and personalities and choices and things that they insist on, shame on you guys. Right? Because to be is to have some degree of self-determination. And God is just like the rest of us like that. In making a universe of open possibility, God has to try to lure all of creation from chaos to cosmos, from chaos to order. And I believe that that's what God does at every second with each of us. But now I need to tell you a story about that, because once you move into that mode, once you believe that power is always relational, power is always persuasive, right? When power is authoritarian, there's no actual authority there. Think about the people in your life who've had the greatest impact, who shaped you and made it possible for you to be yourself. I'm willing to bet that those people, even if they had statutory power over you, their greatness in your heart is because of their relational power, because they saw you truly, they saw your potential, they saw your uniqueness, and they helped you see it better when you were in their presence. That's the God I believe in, that God is at each moment giving us the intuition of what is the next thing we need to do optimally. Process thinkers call that the lure. A lure is something you're pulled to, but you decide whether you're going to follow it or not. And I believe that God's lure pulls us in 4 ways: towards maximizing love, justice, relationship, and experience. At each moment, each one of you knows what would be the best possible use of your time after this talk is done. Who you need to call, who you need to speak to, a conversation you need to have, something you need to take care of. But here's the thing, it's different for everybody in this room. So for God to be God, God has to deliver to each of us an intuition of what is the optimal next step for each of us. When I was a young rabbi, I thought my job when someone came in to tell me a life problem was to listen long enough until I knew the solution, and then I would tell them to go do it. You can imagine how successful those therapy sessions were. But now that I'm a processy rabbi, I realize that my job is to listen carefully enough to help them discern their own lure, which may be very different than mine. Almost always is. So I help them drown out those other voices that are making the lure impossible to hear. Think about our culture. Our culture drowns us with voices telling us we're not male enough, or we're male the wrong way, or we're too old, or we're too young, or we're too fat, or we're too this or too that, right? There are all these voices shouting out our own inner authenticity. And that still small voice is the Lord. That's God. A process story that I didn't know was one at the time. When I was 16, I had just gotten my driver's license, and I was very excited because it meant that I could take the family car and I could go hang out with my high school buddies at some place in San Francisco. At the time, I will point out, I was an atheist. San Francisco is a great place to be an atheist. There's a lot of good things to do and eat in San Francisco. And I was looking forward, now that I had my own driver's license, to living the life. My mother came into my room and she said to me, "Brad, I want you to go visit your grandmother tonight." And then she did the thing I will still never forgive her for. She said, "I'm not going to tell you you have to do it, because you'll do the right thing." Smart mom. And so I did. And of course, you know how this story ends. Now, as a 65-year-old man, I treasure every time I had my grandmother in my presence, every moment with her. I never once think, oh, gee, I wish I had gone to the karaoke bar one more time, right? So the lure is that it's not coercive. You know what the optimal choice is, but you may choose not to do it. But here's how I think God works in and with each of us. A couple years ago, I got a new car. Cars are really interesting these days because now there's a woman who lives in the dashboard. And she, I wouldn't say is all-knowing, but she's really smart. And you tell her where your goal is, and she tells you the best way to get there. Theoretically. There are a couple exceptions. She keeps having me try to drive across Wilshire Boulevard where there isn't a light, because I think she wants me dead. But here's the thing. Most of the time, I listen to her because she really does seem to know how best to get from here to there. But every now and then I don't. Sometimes I don't because I'm distracted. I'm thinking about something that happened at work or something that I need to take care of or a relationship thing, or I'm hungry, or I'm thirsty, or whatever. I don't listen. A couple of weeks ago, I was driving and she told me to take a turn, and the woman in the car next to me was holding a cup of coffee, doing her eyelashes and driving at the same time. And I was so in awe of this multitasking that I forgot to turn. When you do that, she does not respond like the God of conventional theology. She does not respond by saying, you have failed to heed my directions, and therefore you are damned to drive on the 405 for eternity. She says, recalculating. Recalculating means your goal is still the goal. And you made a decision about how to get there, and that is now forever part of your journey. But it doesn't change the goal. So now, integrating that choice, here's the best way to get to your goal. That's exactly what I think God does with everything in the universe. With the rocks and the trees and the bugs and all of us. I think God is reaching out always and giving us the intuition of what's the way to reach the goal optimally. But we always have the power to decide whether we're going to listen or not. God never coerces because God cannot coerce. That to me is very important. If God could coerce but chooses not to, then God's still responsible for all the struggles. But I don't believe in that God. I believe in the God who launches a universe and takes a risk. That we will, with God, make good choices to move the universe towards redemption, one life at a time, one community at a time. Now that changes a couple things. What do you do with the fact that that book in there is filled with commands? You should do this, you shall not do that. What do we mean when we talk about God's commandments? Well, here's what I don't mean. I don't believe in a guy in the sky who barks orders and then gives us citations if we don't wait long enough between eating meat and milk. I just don't believe in that God. But I do believe that that book is full of wisdom, is full of guidelines and suggestions for how to live a better life, and it has built strong, resilient people for millennia. So I think it works in a different way. In Hebrew, the word mitzvah means a command. I think the vast majority of American Jews simply don't believe that. In my own family, I know I'm picking on her a lot tonight, but when my mother comes to visit us, my son is the one who leads Havdalah. You have never experienced a spiritual Havdalah, the end of Shabbat, unless you have heard Jacob lead the Havdalah. It's amazing. And when he starts to do that, my mother starts to weep. And the only thing that will stop her from weeping is if I translate the prayers for her. You have all seen the experience of that. When you pass the Sefer Torah from one generation to another, everyone gets all weepy, and the only way to stop that is to open the book and read from it. Because in Aramaic, another ancient Jewish language, in Aramaic, the word mitzvah means connection, not commandment. And that's exactly what we were feeling when the rabbi led us in Kiddush. You weren't paying attention to what those words meant. You were feeling that you were saying the same prayer that your Bubby and Zaidi used to say, that you remember growing up with, that you remember going to friends' houses with. You hear the associations of those biblical words, and it connects us to something bigger than ourselves. Process theology teaches these are not technically commandments. These are guidelines. These are do's or don't to make your life richer, but you're in the driver's seat. But what it will do uniquely is connect you. It will connect you to wisdom and history and people and experiences and emotions that are otherwise inaccessible. What about prayer? If God isn't an up there, out there, dictating orders kind of God, if God isn't intervening in nature and moving the course of, then what is prayer? Well, our rabbis teach in the Mishnah, which is a earliest rabbinic book from around the year 200 CE, that if you see fire in a distance and you pray, "Dear God, let that not be my home," you have said what they call is a tfilat shav, an empty prayer. Right? What, you're thinking that God is going to say, "Oh, sorry," and the prayer fire is going to lift up and move over and then dump down on the neighbor you hate? No, it's a ridiculous prayer. But what are you doing when you say, "Dear God, please don't let that be my home"? What you're doing is you're putting energy out in the world to try to mobilize people around showing care and resilience and coming forward. When you rose tonight to say Kaddish for your loved ones, I don't know if that changes their metaphysics. I do believe that people live on after death because we are shimmering patterns of resilient energy. And I believe that if we put our love out, that they will receive it in ways we can't conceive. But I also know that when you did that, people looked around the room and noticed who needed a hug and who needed consolation. And that's a prayer answered. So I don't believe in God as a bully in the sky. I don't believe in a God who hands out demerits and honors. And I certainly do not believe that this world is exactly the way God wants it to be. That would make God the biggest underachiever in the universe. But I do believe this universe is full of possibility and full of miraculous magic, and that we have been graced with consciousness and awareness to be able to enter into these relationships and with God to do great things. Because God is not a coercive power. God is a relational power, inspiring us and empowering us. I want to tell you one last story. Well, two. My grandmother was legally blind most of her adult life. She never drove. She never wrote a check. She never did the shopping. When my grandfather died, everybody tried to persuade her to move into an institution. But my grandmother, being a tiny little Jewish lady, was the most stubborn person I knew, all in a good way, and she was not leaving her house. And so for the last 10 years of her life, she figured out how to write checks, how to walk to the supermarket, how to get her stuff done. And looking back on that, I think that she and God pulled off a miracle. not the kind of miracle that they could do in a movie studio. I live in a town where people make those kinds of fraudulent miracles all the time. But nobody in Hollywood could help a 70-year-old blind woman figure out how to find the strength to keep going and to keep living a life of dignity. Only Grandma Dottie and God could do that. My son Jacob, several years ago, despite what all the experts had said, he's never going to be able to do it. You need to stop pushing him. But my wife, whose parents are Israeli, so she comes from stubbornness both on the Jewish side and on the Israeli side. It's like an intensification. Never tell my wife what she can't do. Never. And despite all the experts, she and Jacob pushed his way through high school. And on the day of his high school graduation, I only know this because I filmed it in my camera because I was crying the whole time. Jacob walks across the stage in his blue robe, and they call out his name and they hand him his diploma. And Jacob takes the diploma, and the first thing he does is he opens it because, as he likes to say, he's autistic, but he's not stupid. And he wanted to make sure his name was on that diploma. And then he ran off the stage and he handed it to me. And I said, Jacob, you and God have done a great miracle, the kind that only you and God could have done together. So you remember this moment, because there is nothing that you and God can't do. But God needs you to do it. And remember, your experts, they only know what they know, but they don't know you. And they don't know what you can do. But God does, because God dwells not up there, but in here, in everything that is becoming, inviting us to a great future of engagement and possibility, but no coercion. Shabbat shalom. So I am happy to hear responses, questions, comments. Did you want to?
Can I begin with a couple of questions from class that we left? I just like one or two. So a bit, because that was part of my invitation to class. So could you say something about how following the Lord or your relational approach is different from be good? You know, the theology of morality, the theology of following the Lord, doing the right thing, being
Well, okay. You want me to answer that question without sounding too much like a philosopher, because that would get very boring. Here's what I want to say. How do you know what good is? Right? How do you know that good isn't just what you prefer? So let me tell you a discredited, to my mind, theory of ethics, right? Which is ethics reflects human consensus. It's socially limited. Whatever a society designates as right, that's good for that society. So what do you do with the fact that in the American South, there were a lot more white people than black people? And the white people thought slavery was fine. Does that make it moral? I don't think so. There were a lot more Germans than there were Jews. Does that make the Holocaust moral? I'm not prepared to say that. Here's what I know in my bones. And this, by the way, comes endorsed by my atheist mother, right? There is an absolute standard of right and wrong, good and evil. Some of it gets blurred by culture, but there are core things. No culture has come up with a lengthy justification for why you should try to help people be healthy. But the cultures that kill old people come up with rationales for it. That's an acknowledgement. I believe that morality, like hunger, is natural and innate, and then you decide what you're going to eat when you're hungry. That's where culture kicks in. So for me, one of the things you need God for is there has to be a source of good and bad, right and wrong, that is beyond human consensus. Because I do not concede that whatever the majority says is always right. We've seen that fail too many times. So God's core lure of justice and connection and relationship is absolutely essential to describe the world we live in. The world we live in, by the way, is one in which, despite Western metaphysics, morality is built into it. Infants in their cribs will share with other infants. It's the most astonishing thing. They've done studies where they'll give one baby in a crib less and one baby more, and both babies start to scream, right? You can see, years ago during the first Intifada, I was doing a gig at a synagogue somewhere, and we had this great big 80-pound dog, Humi. And Alana was glued to the television as the Scud missiles were falling down because her brother and sister-in-law, nieces and nephews all live in southern Israel. And the dog did something it has never done before or since. It crawled up on the couch and sprawled over her lap, because the dog knew what was needed at that moment. We live in a universe that bends towards righteousness. That to me is more evidence that there is a God of love and relationship.
So the question, I'm going to attribute it to you, Liz, okay? Which is when we pray, or sometimes when we pray, we're praying for God to, we want God to be powerful and do something like heal someone. How do you think of saying the healing prayer in the context of your life?
So I don't believe in a God who can break the laws of nature. But I also don't believe in a fixed future. I believe that the choices we make, that there are a range of possible futures coming at us, and we help choose which possible future becomes actual. So when I pray for someone who's sick, I don't expect God to break the laws of nature. But I know that there are many possible trajectories for that illness. And so what I ask God to do is to take my energy and use it to bump the vector just a little. And I do believe, and I've experienced it, and I've heard from people, that people can perceive when others are praying on their behalf. So I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to do it because it reminds me to not be passive in the face of the suffering of my loved ones. It reminds me to do something. It lets my community know that I could use some help. And I also believe there's a possibility that it will help give God the extra energy that I've handed and that others praying have handed to then change the outcome. Not as magic, not as breaking the rules, but as one possible outcome as opposed to a different possible outcome.
I'll do the final of my 3 questions, and then I'll allow you to take questions, starting with Audrey. I attribute this to Warren. Warren, are you here? So if I get a question, I saw it there. So if I get it wrong, we'll tell me. Warren said, I love your book, and it really, really spoke to me. And then I went to shul with Rabbi. Okay, so when I went to services, it didn't feel like and I know you said that prayer can connect us in a warm and fuzzy and beyond, but
yeah,
I have to say, Warren, I do disagree. Like when I read the prayers, I see this kind of thinking in it. I see many of the mystical roots of the prayers already here. But how do you experience the liturgy? Is that a fair way to put it? Connecting to this spirituality.
Great. Here's the one thing I would recommend, which you won't be able to do, but would still be what I would recommend. I would urge American Jews to start praying from prayer books where the prayers are laid out as poetry and there's no translation. Because the problem with reading it in English is the English hardens into prose and it loses the poetry. And poetry that is read as prose is inane. I will give you an example. My love is like a red, red rose. I had to memorize that poem in high school. At this point, the only line that's left is that first one. Sorry, Robert Burns. But what I can tell you is if you read that poem as literal, What you're saying about your love is that she is red and smooth and stinky from the neck up and green and prickly from the neck down. Kind of kills the poem, doesn't it? But if you read it as poetry, then what he's saying is the person he loves stands out in his heart the way the rose in a garden stands out among other flowers. That's absolutely true. That has shaped lives across millennia, right? But it's a poetic truth. It's not a factual truth. When I get a anniversary card from my wife and it says, "You're the best wife in the world," she doesn't open that and then say, "What size was your sample?" Right? Because it's not a science truth, it's a heart truth, right? So the challenge is, can you open the prayer book and remember that it's a book of poetry? It's not making literal claims, it's speaking the poetry of yearning, the poetry of hope, the poetry of joy. So I have a prayer book that has only Hebrew in it, and it lays it out in blocks of poetry to remind me that it's poetry. Another thing the prayer book does that I'll just point out, the one you have too, all traditional prayers do this, when it gets to God's name, it doesn't put vowels there. You know why not? Because it turns out Yud, He, Vav are the three Hebrew letters that are both consonants and vowels. A word that's all vowels is just breath. So it's not that you're not allowed to say God's name, which you're not. It's that you can't aspirate God's name except by breathing. So if you want to say the name of the Holy One, try this. Baruch atah Eloheinu melech haolam. That will change your prayers. If you're not praying to someone with a name like Brad, but you're praying to the breath of the cosmos, and you're offering ancient poetry that our people have sculpted across the years, and you keep reminding yourself it's just poetry. It's poetry. That will change the Siddur for you. Welcome.
Okay, so I like this guy you're talking about. It's very nice.
This God likes you too.
Yeah, I don't believe in a God who goes around killing innocent Egyptian babies who didn't do anything wrong. And the kind of guy you're talking about doesn't. I want to know, what do you do at your own Seder? No, you've got this stuff. What do you do?
Remain standing, please. Before I answer that question, I need to ask you a couple more questions. Do you believe that God actually caused the sea to split? Be honest with me. Just talk to me. Was there a day and the month where an ocean actually opened up? Honestly. I'm not arguing. I'm just asking you what you think. Okay, I don't know. I'm going to take I don't know in a synagogue to a rabbi on Shabbat as hell no. I'm just not going to say it here. Next question. Okay, you don't know. Good enough. I don't believe that an actual sea opened up. Sorry. Oh, I got it. You got it. I'll stand up. But it doesn't matter. I don't hear. No, but I want to see you. Okay. I don't believe in God and little babies either. But here's what I do. I will thank you for this. I believe that there are two ways in which stories can be true. They can be true as history. Did it actually happen? Or they can be true as impact. Does this story matter? So let me tell you a different story, and then we'll look at history or matter. Years ago, I went to Mount Vernon, to George Washington and Martha Washington's home. And the most interesting thing, I mean, you go to those things, you see a big building, you see slave quarters, which are atrocious. You see chairs and tables and cloth things, whatever. But the thing that caught my mind was his false teeth on the mantle. Turns out that George had really bad dental problems his entire adult life and had the misfortune of living in the 1700s. So the options were kind of minimal. So he had these atrocious teeth. He had ivory teeth, he had human teeth, he had wooden teeth. None of them alleviated his pain. Was that historically true? Yes. Did that have historical impact? Did that shape American culture in any significant way? No. There's a story told about George that at his bar mitzvah, you have strange congregants. At his bar mitzvah, his father gave him a hatchet. And so George went outside to use the hatchet and chopped down his father's favorite cherry tree. You know this story? Great, because millions of American kids have been told this story ever since 1876. There's not a record of it from 1875 or before that. The first time we hear that story, just like the chucking the dollar across the Potomac, is in the centennial year. You're saying, That story, not historically true. Does that mean it's false? Not if you measure truth by impact. Generation after generation of American kids learned to not tell a lie because of that story. It had way more impact than the teeth. What if the Torah isn't aiming to be a history book? What if it's means to be a book of lessons for how to live your life well? I will tell you there is no story more true than the Exodus story. Because what the Exodus story teaches, which is not a scientific fact, and it's not a historic fact, you'll never prove this, it's just true. Every person deserves to be free. And there is a power in the universe that will help bring us to freedom if we listen and we get up and we act. And if we march together, there's a place of promise waiting for us. I have staked my life on that truth. I would die for that truth. It just never happened. But the really true stories aren't in the history column, they're in the meaning column. So I don't believe in a God who breaks the laws of nature. I do not believe in a God who intervenes and decides that person's going to die and that person's going to inherit a lot of money. But I do believe that whoever was listening to the lure and then turning that into stories and prohibitions and imperatives, distilled it into a book that is the most true book I've ever seen. I'll share with you a conversation. We were having a conversation over dinner with an eminent classicist, and I mentioned that last year I reread Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which, by the way, are great books and well worth reading, and probably never happened that way either. Okay, but no one's bothered by the fact that Homer made it up. So, but in that book, I realized, having now spent 30 years reading Tanakh, that not a single commoner gets to speak. Never. Not one. The only slaves that get to speak in Homer's book are kidnapped royalty. And the gods never talk to commoners. They only talk to kings and princes. And that's true of Egyptian literature and Babylonian literature and Assyrian literature and whatever Greek and Roman literature I've ever read. Where did the Torah get this radical, unprecedented idea that the divine cares about common people? that the divine reveals to everybody. What we know about Sinai is that everybody was present. The men, the women, the children, the slaves, the free, everybody was there. They didn't get that from any surrounding culture. The Torah did that all by itself. It's an astonishing book. So do I need to know that there was a particular mountain or that that happened on a particular date? Do I need to know that that was a historical event? The miracle is that a group of Israelites could track the truth of the Spirit so well that they created a story that it has changed the world. People who walk around believing in human equality are children of Torah, whether they know it or not, because that's where that came from.
Why don't we take one or two more, and because I know we have a long weekend ahead. Anybody else? All right.
And standards, whatever, in your book, which is wonderful, you mentioned in the footnotes. In the footnotes, you mentioned process theology from other things.
Yes.
Other traditions.
Yes.
And that not to receive Judaism, but the process theology begin in Yahoo, or did it begin in other faiths?
Yeah.
And can you talk about who brought it from other faiths into Yahoo?
Sure. So process theology has roots in different cultures, but the first people to think about it in an organized way were Protestant. Specifically, there was a remarkable man, Alfred North Whitehead, who was originally a mathematician. He wrote with Bertrand Russell the famous and rarely read 3-volume Principia Mathematica, which, if your library has it, you don't need to reserve it. It's there on the shelf anytime. Take a look. And then he went from England and he became a professor of philosophy at Harvard. And he set for himself the task of saying, okay, the move from Newtonian physics to Einstein's relativity and quantum requires a new metaphysics. And so he created a system of that. And he wrote an utterly unreadable, brilliant, remarkable book that I'm not even going to tell you the name of, because trust me, if you have problems sleeping at night, this book will handle that for you. Right? And Whitehead was, in his personal example, as extraordinary as he was in his philosophy. Really a remarkable human being. And then he taught it to a generation of philosophers, and they taught it to a generation of philosophers, the living great-granddaddy of process thought, now someone who teaches in Claremont in Southern California, named John Cobb. And John Cobb is a miraculous human being, Methodist minister from Georgia. And he has written magnificent and easy to read books on process theology. But let me tell you a Jewish process story. So when Harold Kushner wrote his wonderful book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, he did like all good authors do, and he took to the road to try to boost sales of the book by giving talks. And at every single talk, some Christian would come up to him and say, you know, that sounds exactly like Whitehead. Or they would say, that sounds exactly like process theology. And Kushner, being a very well-educated Jew, said, what? Because here's what Kushner got, being a Jew, that Whitehead, being a Protestant, I know this is a generalization, didn't get. Whitehead thought that if you write interesting thoughts, however badly, people would slog through them. But Jews know you need to pay attention to marketing. So Kushner took these ideas, not knowing they had started with Whitehead, and he wrote a book that's actually compelling to read. But the So, and there were others before me, but I think I'm really the first who tried to systemically. Because okay, I partly joke, and it's not really entirely a joke, that I invented process theology. And then I discovered that this SOB had beat me to it by 100 years. Because I had come up with my main ideas, and then I found a book on process thought, and I read it and went, oh my God, this is it. Those are my ideas. So what I did was I wrote a book which presents it in Jewish terms and with Jewish examples. But I will tell you, the circle of process thinkers are wonderful people. They have embraced me and included me. And if you're interested in a multi-faith presentation of these ideas, there's an online site called Open Horizons. And it's worth, they have really interesting essays by people of all different traditions and backgrounds. And it's really a beautiful thing to spend time sifting through.
I'll just say that this is the book that we're talking about. Those who are in the class know it. It's God and Becoming a Relationship, the Dynamic Nature of Process Theology, in which you do say, while maybe systematically it's relatively recent, but nevertheless, you're pretty good at showing it in Kabbalistic sources.
Yes.
And rabbinic sources.
So what I will say about that is that I think what process does for me, it does two things that are incredibly important in my life. One, it made it possible for me to worship God again. Like I could let God back in, because this God is my ally in helping Jacob, not Jacob's torturer. But the second thing is it provided a tool for then reopening classical Jewish sources like the Talmud, the Mishnah, and others, and suddenly they make sense. I don't think that the great rabbis of old practiced that same dominant theology. I think their benefit was they weren't really systemic theologians at all, but what they held on to is God is loving. And even if that doesn't make sense, that's what we're going to hold on to. And so they never prioritized God's power over God's love. So I think process becomes a tool to reopen classical Jewish sources.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good thing. Thank you for following the lore tonight to come here in person. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning. Shabbat Shalom.